I suppose you think that's what that's for. Do you?
Well, it works quite well, Sergeant, yes.
Well, my lad, maybe it's time that you put that away, get into your kit, and I will show you what that's really for.
Yes, Sergeant, right away.
The Martini-Henry, like most infantry weapons of the late 19th century, was hamstrung by the technology found in common military full-bore rifles of the day. It could only fire one shot before having to reload. Although it represented a great evolutionary step in infantry weapons over its predecessors in the Enfield and Snider, warfare of the mid to late Victorian era was still governed by the possibility, or indeed some cases the necessity, of close-quarters fighting, and it was for this purpose that the Martini was fitted for a bayonet. There are many anecdotes of actions and battles where enemies of Queen Victoria came face to face with her soldiers. It was in these instances where that thin piece of steel was all that stood between Tommy Atkins and his maker. As explained in an earlier video, the bayonet had come about in the late 17th century as a solution to having to carry two types of weapons on the battlefield, namely the pike and the musket. With the bayonet, the soldier could play both roles as required. By the High Victorian era, the bayonet had evolved into the last of a long line of socket bayonets. This saw the continued use of a locking ring as the best way to keep the weapon fixed to the muzzle, and although the initial issue of the Martini had been accompanied by a modified Enfield or Snider bayonet, by 1876 a standalone pattern had been adopted, measuring some 21 inches in length. It was known as the Lunger, presumably because of its length and Tommy's sense of humor. This pattern was augmented by a Yataghan sword bayonet for use by the rifle regiments and all sergeants of infantry, although for both it was rarely fixed for anything other than actual close-quarters combat. This sword bayonet had been issued way back in 1860 with the Enfield short rifle, and, like the first pattern of Martini socket bayonet, it had been bushed to fit the more slender barrel of that weapon. Other patterns, some experimental, and some for use by other arms, such as the artillery, and even a cutlass variation for use in the Navy, completed the panoply of Martini-Henry cold steel. But it is the socket pattern bayonet of 1876 that is most identified with the weapon, and it is this version that will be used here. Soldiers of the Victorian era were taught a series of movements in order to familiarize themselves with the use of the bayonet. Conducted on the square or in the gymnasium, these movements were taught as a regimented series of positions in a drill-like fashion. Once these were mastered, more advanced training, often conducted by regimental instructors rather than company NCOs, could be attempted. This set of movements was known as the Bayonet Exercise, and had changed little since the Enfield and Snider. The first part of the Bayonet Exercise was known as the preliminary drill, and was performed thus. Once the men had shaken out for safe distance, the position of port arms was adopted. The first position, as it was known in the Bayonet Exercise, was in fact the position of charge bayonets from the manual exercise. Used here, it was simply a transitionary position. The second position, also known as the guard, was adopted by simply drawing back the right foot so that it formed a right angle with the left, at a distance of 24 inches. The body was lowered slightly, and the knees were bent to form a stable, athletic stance. From the second, the third position was adopted by shifting the weight forward without moving the feet. This would become integral to the many attacks taught later. Note here how the weight is shifted over the left foot without changing the position of the upper body. On the word of command, second position, the weight was simply shifted back, re-adopting that position. In order to close with an adversary, a series of advances and retires could be practiced, each ending in the second position. On the word of command, advance, the left foot was shot forward a small pace, followed up with similar size pace with the right foot. The same sort of movement could be done to the rear. On the word of command, retire, the right foot pushed back a small pace, followed up with a rearward pace of the left foot. Yet more ground could be gained by the use of the double advance. Here, first the right foot was drawn up to the rear of the left, and then the left foot shot forward, covering more ground than in the basic advance. Following on, the double retire provided that extra degree of movement to the rear. In this case, the left foot was moved back to the right, and then the right pushed back, adopting the original position. The preliminary drill was ended formally by the readoption of the first position, or charge bayonets, followed by the subsequent adoption of the position of shoulder arms. Once the preliminary drills were complete, the main part of the bayonet exercise could be taught.
Guards and points by numbers in slow time!
Like most things in the army, it was taught first by numbers. The guard and point. From the position of the charge, the men were brought to the guard.
Guard!
This was the second position, as taught in the preliminary drills.
Point! 2!
On the word of command point, the rifle was thrust out to the extent of the left arm. Simultaneously, the weight was shifted forward in the fashion of the third position. On the word of command 2, the second position was readopted. The rifle was brought back to the guard, and simultaneously the weight was shifted back, evenly balanced between the feet. The low guard and point were used to engage an enemy at a lower elevation.
Low guard! Point! 2!
On the word of command low guard, the rifle was rotated so that the sling faced uppermost. The muzzle was dropped, pointing the bayonet towards the ground, and the butt was raised behind the head. On the word of command point, the rifle was thrust downward to the fullest extent of the left arm. Simultaneously, the legs were moved to the third position, shifting the weight forward over the left foot. Note that as the rifle is thrust forward, it is rotated so that the sling faces down. On the word of command 2, the rifle was rotated and drawn back to the low guard. Simultaneously, the weight was shifted to the rear, evenly balanced between the feet. The high guard and point were used to engage an enemy at a higher elevation, such as one standing on a parapet or one mounted on a horse.
High guard! Point! 2!
On the word of command high guard, the rifle was rotated so that the muzzle and bayonet pointed up. The rifle was held at a 45-degree angle, with the sling down. The head and eyes were also raised. On the word of command point, the rifle was thrust forward to the fullest extent of the left arm, up at a 45-degree angle, as though engaging a mounted man. Simultaneously, the body was rocked forward in the manner of the third position. On the word of command 2, the rifle and body were brought back to the position of the high guard. The head parry was a maneuver used to defend the upper body and head against an attack from above, from a sword or lance.
Head parry! Point! 2!
On the word of command head parry, the rifle was rotated up to the right with the sling uppermost. The butt was drawn back behind the head. On the word of command point, the rifle was rotated and thrust forward to the fullest extent of the left arm, in a similar fashion to the point given from the high guard. On the word of command 2, the rifle was rotated back to the position of the head parry. Shorten arms was used to engage an enemy that was particularly close, closer in fact than the tip of the bayonet when held at the guard.
Shorten! Arms! Point! 2!
On the word of command shorten arms, from the head parry the rifle was drawn back so that the right arm was extended fully to the rear. The muzzle of the rifle rested on the upper left arm and the bayonet was oriented to the front. Note also how the sling was held uppermost. Simultaneously, the left leg was straightened, drawing the body back. On the word of command point, the rifle was thrust forward to the fullest extent of the left arm, simultaneously rotating so that the sling faced down. Although shown here incorrectly, The body remained with the left leg straight, instead of rocking forward to the third position. On the word of command 2, the rifle was withdrawn back to the position of shorten arms. The basic bayonet exercise was ended with a readoption of the guard.
Guard!
This was followed by the adoption of the first position,
First position!
followed by shoulder arms.
Shoulder! Arms!
The bayonet exercise was further developed by the addition of variations on guards and points. Simply put, this was the bayonet exercise conducted facing slightly to the left or to the right, giving the soldier more flexibility in the application of his bayonet fighting.
Variations of guard and point by numbers in a slow time. Guard! Right. Point. 2. Left. Point. 2. No guard. Point. 2. High guard. Point. 2. Right. Point. 2. No guard. Point. 2. Guard.
Further flexibility was afforded by conducting the bayonet exercise while turned about.
About.
On the word of command about, the body was pivoted about 180 degrees on the heels. The feet ended up being in a reciprocal position to that of the original stance. Simultaneously, the rifle was drawn up vertically in a semicircular arc to face 180 degrees to the rear. Note the change of hand position. The rifle continued to be held at the guard, with the bayonet elevated slightly at a man's chest. From this new position, points and guards could be adopted and executed, albeit with the reverse grip. By the mid-1880s, the review exercise, used at reviews or inspections, had become a comprehensive demonstration of bayonet techniques.
Review exercise. Guard.
First, the basic exercise was performed.
Point. No guard. Point. High guard. Point. Head parry. Point. Shorten. Arms. Point.
Once the basic exercise was complete, the variations to the left and to the right were performed.
Right. Point. Left. Point. No guard. Point. High guard. Point. Right. Point. No guard. Point.
Once the variations of points and guards were delivered,
Guard.
the men were then turned about, and the entire exercise was repeated facing the opposite direction.
About. Point. No guard.
The exercise was
Point.
repeated using the reverse hand positions.
High guard.
Once this was done, the men were turned about to face the front.
About. First position. Shoulder. Arms.
The techniques shown so far would all be described as basic bayonet techniques. There were, however, more advanced ones. Alfred Hutton, who was a prominent fencing master in the Victorian age, was a proponent of more advanced techniques. In his manual of 1882, he elaborates on some of the basic movements taught in the bayonet exercise. While in the basic bayonet exercise there is but passing mention of how to parry, in Hutton's manual there are 4 such movements. He also describes a technique known as the beat or the feint. He goes on to list 3. Another aspect of fighting with bayonets that is not covered in the bayonet exercise is the use of the butt of the rifle. Hutton makes mention of 4 different strikes with the butt. Now, the demonstration of these techniques is beyond the scope of this video, and indeed would be a subject of a video unto themselves. There appears to have been some resistance in the army to the teaching of perhaps more advanced bayonet fighting techniques. The fear was that the impetus of an assault or charge upon the enemy would be lost, as the men, applying their greater bayonet fencing knowledge, might stop and engage man-to-man with the enemy, instead of running them down with sheer aggression, thus maintaining the momentum of the assault. Today, bayonet fencing would fall under the realm of what's known as historical European martial arts, or HEMA for short. There is perhaps no better place to refer someone who's interested in this kind of thing than to Matt Easton of Scholagladiatoria. He runs a very successful HEMA school and YouTube channel of the same name. In it, there's a heavy emphasis on HEMA and HEMA-related subjects. He kindly lent me the use of this 1-minute video demonstrating some techniques used, in this case with a P53 Enfield rifle musket, but eminently applicable to the Martini-Henry. Inspired by this, I elected to try my own bit of shadow fencing, but certainly more clunky and awkward. In the same vein, also trying to demonstrate this using the equipment and uniform of the period. I tried some advances and double advances, and the retires correspondingly. Also points and high guards, low guards, some parries and shorten arms. I tried some about turns with the corresponding change in hand grip. I even tried a point in tierce, as mentioned in Hutton, essentially a point made from a raised version of the low guard. Looking back, I had great fun trying this out, but especially on reviewing the footage, it was probably a good thing I was by myself. I mean, really, what would you have done if you were driving through the woods and came across this lunatic stabbing the air? If you were a subscriber, of course, I'd hope you'd stop and say hello.